Welcome to Tipton County Pulse. I'm Barrie Foster, Director of the Tipton County Museum Veterans Memorial and Nature Center in Covington, Tennessee. Today we're with Nancy Foshee, who's a local author, a local award-winning author. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you.
And congratulations on the success of your book.
Thank you.
We have your books for sale in our gift shop, and you've been writing for how long?
Oh, probably my whole life, but these books I started writing them, maybe about 8-9 years ago.
Okay,
So-
and you're a teacher?
I'm a retired teacher, yes,
Okay, and you taught at Memphis City Schools,
right, for close to 30 years.
and then you taught at Dyersburg State Community College
Yes.
here in Covington.
Yes, in Tipton County here.
All right,
Yeah.
awesome. And we are so thrilled to be here with you today discussing this book, which again, we have for sale in our gift shop. And I read it and I loved it and I thought it was beautifully written.
Well, thank you.
And I want to say I'm looking forward to the sequel.
Okay, thank you.
Well, so tell us about the story. Where and when does the story take place?
Well, it takes place in Baltimore, and it's during the War of 1812. And I start this book about June of 1814. It goes through the events leading up to the battle at Fort Mchenry. Includes when the British burned Washington, and then after the battle, the British finally leave Chesapeake Bay. So, you know, it covers that time period.
Okay. How did you choose the title?
Well, the battle at Fort Mchenry is where we got our national anthem, and this is where Francis Scott Key writes it. And I took just a phrase from the first verse of the 4 verses, by the way. There are 4 verses to our national anthem. Most people don't know that, but anyway, I just took a phrase from the first verse.
Okay. Who are the main characters of the story?
Well, the girl who's pictured on the cover is supposed to be Laurel O'Malley. She's the daughter of a country doctor on the outskirts of Baltimore, on the way to Fort Mchenry. Her family, of course, are all involved in the story. And then there's a Captain Brett Harrington, and he is a privateer. Now, I have to explain what a privateer is.
Thank you. I kind of had to look that up myself.
Right. A privateer, during the War of 1812, we had, I think, about 6 ships in our Navy, and the British had about 100. So the President of the United States at that time, James Madison, he would commission private individuals who had ships and could manage a crew, and the whole purpose of their commission was to go out into the Atlantic Ocean and harass British merchant ships, the purpose of which would be to maybe bring the British to the peace treaty circumstance sooner rather than later. So, but he's a privateer and a really good guy.
Now, how do these two first meet?
She is coming back from Lexington Market, just doing a little shopping with her younger brother, and he had just let her off of the carriage, and she was walking up the steps when she heard a voice behind her calling and asking if this was where Dr. O'Malley lived. When she turned back around, the stranger, who turns out to be Captain Harrington, has pulled up a wagon with 2 injured crew members. And when she sees how serious those wounds are, she calls for her family to come out and help, and they take the crew members in so that Dr. O'Malley can treat them.
Okay, and what challenges do the two of them face?
Well, for one thing, Laurel has been in a courtship, not an official courtship, but she's been involved in sending letters back and forth with a young lieutenant who is going to be stationed at Fort Mchenry. And he was someone she had known most of her life. So she's involved in a courtship, and when the captain shows up, she fights any attraction she has for him because she feels committed to the lieutenant. At the same time, Captain Harrington is attracted to her, but then finds out very quickly that she is involved with somebody else, and she's kind of off limits to him. So there is the tension between the two of them, trying to sort through their feelings, and at the same time, the social mores of the time require that she remain loyal, if you will, to the lieutenant.
What makes this story so realistic? How did you make it so realistic?
Well, I was about halfway into the story, maybe chapter 11 or 10, and I realized I needed to go back up to Baltimore, the Baltimore area. I guess what I need to say is that I was raised in Baltimore.
Okay.
You know, first grade through fifth grade I spent there, so I knew the importance of Fort Mchenry. And when I got into writing, I realized I needed to go back. And so in May of 2013, my husband and I flew to Baltimore. We spent a week there. We went to the Maryland Historical Society, where I gathered a lot more information to inform my book. We went to Fells Point, which is sort of a subdivision, if you will, right on at the harbor, and this is where all the ships were built at the time of this story. And so I walked those streets, which are still cobblestone streets, so it gave an air of realism even in memories. And then, of course, I went to Fort Mchenry. When we came back, it took me less than 2 months to finish the book because my memories were so recent. I was able to put them into, for Laurel's memories. I made them part of her.
Okay. And I was just wondering if part of you came out in Laurel. I mean, from your youth.
Actually, yes. When I write female characters, to give them any sense of authenticity, I often give them, memories of my own. In this book, Laurel's mother has passed away when she was a young girl, but her mother played the piano. And Laurel mentions having stood and listened to her mother play rather than to come into the room. That was actually one of my own experiences.
Okay. Well, that's nice.
Yeah.
That's really neat. What kind of romance is this story?
Well, it's a romance. I used to kid folks and say, I wanted something that I wouldn't be embarrassed to hand to my mother to read, and I wouldn't be embarrassed for her to hand it off to her friends at church. It's more along the lines of a Jane Austen kind of romance, where the focus is on relationships, and the focus is also on the social restrictions of the time. And so, I put that in the book, and really, my husband will agree, kind of strangely enough, anytime you try to make the story about, sex, if you will, that tends to muddy the story. And I wanted to focus the story.
I agree. I felt like this was refreshing, especially in this day and age, what you're seeing out there in the media and
Yeah.
everything. And I felt it was very refreshing, and I really enjoyed it. So why did you write this book, O'er the Ramparts? What
Well-
made you,
Okay, that one, that goes back to having lived in Baltimore as a young girl and knowing about Fort Mchenry and having visited there as a child. But when I became a teacher in American history and American literature, I discovered something that was a little disconcerting. You look at a typical high school American history book, and you would have a lot of emphasis on the Revolutionary War. You'd have a lot of emphasis on the development of the Constitution, and then you fast forward, for the most part, to the Civil War. And the War of 1812 is just sort of maybe a page, if that much. Generally speaking, I remember in one book it was 2 paragraphs talking about the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is much more significant than most people know. There are some historians that call it our second war for independence, because from within 35 years from the Revolutionary War to the War of 1812, we're dealing with the same conflict between us and the British. And this time, it's not it is our independence, but it's also our right to be a nation in the War of 1812. So I just really felt like that was a story worth telling, and I hoped I could tell it well. So.
Well, I think you did.
Yeah.
I think you did, and I think that's why we're sitting here today. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So the Battle of Fort McHenry, why was it so important?
Okay. At this time, and I mentioned the privateers, but at this time in history, Baltimore was the 3rd largest city in what we call the United States at this time. And it was the home port of most of the privateers. And this is where the clipper ship came out at this time. The British knew that, and they had been fighting different skirmishes all up and down the Atlantic coast. They had blockaded us on the Atlantic coast, and they had a particular interest in capturing Baltimore because it was in the center of the whole Atlantic coast cities. From there, it was just like 45 miles north to Philadelphia, about the same distance down to what they called Washington City. We call Washington, D.C. today. And it would have taken them no time at all with their army and their navy to have completely recaptured our colonies. Baltimore stood in the way of that, and Fort McHenry kept them from getting to Baltimore. So yes, it's a very significant battle. The British, at the end of this battle, the British retreat, if you will. They had about 60 ships in Chesapeake Bay at this time, 60. And so that all of those ships leave, they regroup down in Jamaica. In the interim, the ministers, foreign ministers in Britain and our Secretary of War concluded, an armistice, if you will, and that was all done before the end of the year. In the meantime, the British tried to circle around to New Orleans, and then they lost 6,000 soldiers there. But that particular battle was more of an exclamation point than a period, because without the Fort McHenry battle and the success there would have been a battle at New Orleans.
Okay.
So,
If you were so concerned about educating people about the significance of this battle, why didn't you just write a nonfiction book?
well, there are lots of history books and nonfiction books written about the battle at Fort McHenry. What I wanted to do was to bring out the emotions of the ordinary people as they faced down the British. The people in Baltimore knew there were 60 ships out there in the Chesapeake Bay. They were hearing stories regularly of folks along the Chesapeake Bay who had been attacked by the British, who were taking their their livelihood, their livestock, their whatever managed, vegetables or whatever they could get. They would take from from farmers along the coast. And here in Baltimore, these folks heard those stories and knew how precarious their situation was. And at the same time, the courage that it took, knowing those soldiers were just on the other side of the inner channel, the anxiety that folks would have felt, concerned about their families, and just the panic, particularly right after the British set fire to Washington. People in Baltimore could see those fires raging up and thought any minute the British were going to be in Baltimore. So I just really wanted to bring out the emotions of the common people in regards to this situation.
I certainly felt it, and it kind of surprised me because you're right. When you read in history, you read the facts and you don't feel the emotions, and you portrayed it, I think, beautifully in the story, especially with Laurel and her family, the toll and the fact that the ships that brought in the goods, I guess the merchant ships, they were discontinued for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were shortages of things, and you just never think of that. No, and you made the reader feel like they were part of that, and that to me was very interesting.
Oh, thank you. That's what I was trying to do.
Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why were you willing to adapt your novel to a screenplay?
Well, of all of my books that I've written, this is the one that I thought was, I guess, maybe necessary for people to see. And I thought it was that it had the potential to be a good movie, that it would be both entertaining but also educational. And in our day and time, you're really trying to reach your audience, and particularly young people. I thought young people could watch this and get a sense of just how serious this was.
In researching this novel, what was the most surprising thing that you learned?
Well, the most surprising thing to me was how fast we had what we call a national anthem. I mean, it wasn't even a week after the battle that people were singing the song in the saloons and such. And here's how. Francis Scott Key, of course, had gone out to a British Admiralty ship out in the Chesapeake Bay to negotiate the release of a Dr. Beams, who had been taken captive at Washington. And so he's out there, and the Admiral says, sure, you can have this guy, but you can't go anywhere until we're through with the battle. So Francis Scott Key is stuck there watching the bombs bursting in air and the rockets' red glare and all of this. He's watching it, and he's writing this poem. And he entitles the poem In Defense of Fort McHenry, because he kept seeing the flag, the Star-Spangled Banner that we call. He didn't call it that, he called it that in the verses. Well, he got back to Baltimore Friday night after the battle that had been Tuesday into Wednesday. Saturday morning, he handed this poem over to his friend John Skinner and said, what do you think of this? And John said, oh, this is pretty good. He said, let me take it to a printer. So John Skinner takes this poem, and it says, in defense of Fort McHenry, sung to the tune of Anacreon in Heaven. Well, most folks don't know, but To Anacreon in Heaven was like a fraternity drinking song, okay?
Ooh.
That everybody knew it. I mean,
Okay.
it was, if I were to say to you today, this is sung to the tune of Amazing Grace, you would immediately know how to sing it. Well, that was the case here. So they printed off 1,000 copies of this, and they started passing them out in Baltimore, around Baltimore Harbor, and in Fells Point, where a lot of the sailors live. And the afternoon of Monday afternoon, not even a week since the battle, folks are singing "Oh Say Can You See" by the dawn's early light everywhere. And then within about 2 weeks, people in Boston and in New York City were singing the song. It went everywhere. And this is without cell phones, without computers, without TVs, without even radio, telephones,
yeah.
any of that, any of the mass communications that we think about today. This took off just like wildfire, just because Francis Scott Key had this poem printed and folks were singing it. I found that fascinating, you know, it was, I don't know, just sort of like the, an end to the battle is, you know, this song.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And he wasn't even a writer. I mean,
No.
he had a totally different profession.
Oh yeah, he was a lawyer. He did this. This was something he did in his spare time.
Wow. Wow. What a brain. What a brain.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being here today. We're real excited about this book. Keep us posted. Again, it's for sale in our gift shop, and I loved it, and we're just excited for you. This is like this is great. This is great for you, and we're real thrilled for you.
Well, thank you. I'm excited and a little on edge about it, but excited. I really think that this is a book that will has the potential to make a good movie.
I agree.
Well,
I
thank you.
agree. And thank you. And we'll see you at the Tipton County Museum.